Where to start? That's the problem. I think we should start really with the present. What I want to do quickly is look over some of the influences that I underwent during my time as an academic. I'm going to actually talk about, just very briefly, 5 separate books. But I was really puzzled as to where I should begin. Well, if we start with the present, I think not. Yes. It's still moving. Well, oh, bother. The first circle, the 3 outer circles represent kind of interests that I have. But the center, the circle in the center is basically what my work has been grounded in. It's been grounded in linguistics and most particularly in discourse analysis. And my scholarship and research has really been around the intersection of the media and language, literature and language, and culture and society and language. So I kind of, from a base in linguistics, face 3 separate ways. But how did I get to this point in the middle, and with these 3 interests? So I was trying to think, how far back should I go? Maybe not this far back. Yeah, I was reading books by this time, but not the right ones, I don't think. And I think I always had a sort of fascination with speed. And maybe it's time that I left Macau because I already have 2 speeding tickets, which I incurred accelerating out of the tunnel. No, actually driving a car. So another possibility would be, do you recognize this person here? This was a few years later, in 1984 roughly, in one of my first lecturing jobs at what was then the Polytechnic of Wales. It had previously been the College of Mines in South Wales. Mining was a very important activity in South Wales. The College of Mines became the Polytechnic of Wales, and it was there that I wrote my first single-authored book. And thus it's me typing away. Actually, this is an early example of a selfie. Which the class in media discourse will appreciate. Yes. But I think that's probably a little bit too far. I need to go back a little bit from there. So forward from me on the bike and backwards from me in the Polytechnic of Wales to the University of Birmingham. This is where I did my undergraduate degree and where I did postgrad, and I did a fair amount of research there. So, but I was there in 1968, and I think, see, I'm a child of the last half century. That's right, yes. I was born about 2 years after the end of World War II. There was still wartime food rationing was still going on. I remember going with my father with the ration cards to hand them in at the end of food rationing. So I was born around the middle of the I'm so last century, it's unbelievable. It's a surprise that I'm still standing now, actually. Especially if my hand keeps shaking. So I managed, by various accidents, to get to the University of Birmingham in 1968 with no knowledge of what was going to happen. In the first term, actually, I had no understanding of it, but Noam Chomsky came and he took part in a debate with a well-known British philosopher on the topic of, electrifying topic, should traditional grammar be ended or mended? I can see the astonished look. Noam Chomsky was that he is, I nearly said he was, he is still, we're both still alive, which is a good thing. He's undoubtedly, I think, even for those Hallidayans amongst us, the most celebrated linguist of the age. And he came, and actually, it was fascinating. It took place, the debate took place, oh, the green dot's moving again. It took place down, it took place down there, on the right, in a room, packed lecture theatre. And in those days, academics all smoked haze of cigarette smoke. And there was nothing like, you know, PowerPoint or things like that. Basically a blackboard and a piece of chalk. And he outlined transformational genitive grammar intensely for about 40 minutes, I think. I understood nothing, absolutely. And then there was a reply from the British philosopher, which was completely, I think, it was like ships passing in the night. There was no connection between the two. That was my first introduction to linguistics, and in fact it just confirmed in me that I was really very interested in literature and not very interested in linguistics at that point. Also, of course, it being 1968, it was the year of student uprisings, occupations, protests, debate, and November, Chomsky came, December, the students had occupied the administration block, and the university was almost in kind of lockdown. Oh, intense debate everywhere. Every occupied building was, the students were gathering in groups, and there was a great deal of deliberation, argument, different points of view. How am I doing for time?
Go ahead.
Okay. There was like, I mean, the university just basically came to a standstill, and but at the same time it was incredibly intellectually stimulating, challenging. There was lots of debate between staff and students and so on, and eventually, after about a week or so, some kind of compromise was reached, and we had a kind of mass meeting in this area here, with TV crews on the top of this building here. You see my hands calming down now. All of this area was full of students, and the Students' Union president addressed the students and put a motion that we should end the sit-in because we'd extracted various concessions. But the interesting thing about it from my point of view at that time was this is the library. And along the front of the library was this kind of brick wall, which you can't really see, especially with the Greek dots. Anyway, and on this wall, the students' Maoist group, well, there were about 20 of them, but very energetic and very committed. They had painted in large white capital letters, "Seek truth from facts," and they added, "to serve the people." And well, we all knew that this was, of course, 68, you know, the Cultural Revolution was in motion, and what they had done was to bring one of Mao's sayings and painted it on the brick wall of the library. So there was this kind of a very unusual conjunction of intense student debate on the one hand, and this saying from Mao, which was there right across the front of the library. And it stayed there for quite a time because the paint, I don't know what paint they used, but it was very difficult to get off. In fact, in the end, I think they planted ivy along the front of the wall in order to obscure it. But actually, this phrase kind of haunts me over the years. Apparently in '78, in an address to the Communist Party Congress, National Congress, Deng Xiaoping used the phrase again, said with a different ending. But anyway, I'll maybe try and come back to it. So I began my degree. Well, by this time I was at the end of my first term, completely in the spin with all of this going on. But I was studying for a degree in English. Technically, it was English language and literature, and we did have courses on the history of the language. I had a course on modern English grammar, but I wasn't actually terribly excited by those. I was more interested in novels, plays, poetry, and so on. And before I get on to the books which influenced me, I had three very important teachers. Well, they were all excellent, actually, but these three kind of remain in my mind. This is the first of them. It's David Lodge, who had just got back from the States. He'd been at Berkeley, and he'd been kind of quite influenced by, of course, '68, like in the States, there's student protests everywhere. So he was a very stimulating figure in the department. Quite quiet, but I did at least one course, two courses with him, and they were on comparative critical approaches, and he was very much a kind of influence. He just published a book called The Language of Fiction. That was in 1966, but he already had 4 or 5 novels to his credit, and very soon the campus novels began to come out, which are very funny depictions of us academics and our eccentric behaviour. I've seen nothing like that in the university. There was no material here for a novel. The second figure who was very influential for me was John Sinclair. Both David Lodge and John Sinclair, these pictures are from a much older state of their life. They were much younger then. John Sinclair was only about 35 when he was appointed to the foundation chair of modern English language at the University of Birmingham. He had no publications to his credit that we know of at that time. This is how the world has changed. He was just about to publish with Malcolm Coulthard a book called Towards an Analysis of Discourse. And part of the reason why it's one of those quirks of the difference between last century and this century is somebody at Birmingham must have anticipated that this person, without any or hardly any publication to his credit, was a future academic star. And he was appointed in, I think, 1965. It took him about 5 years, probably, to publish a book called Towards an Analysis of Discourse. Now, discourse is on everybody's lips these days. Everybody talks about discourse in the humanities and in the social sciences. But in those days, it was unknown territory. And in linguistics, it was a huge step. And in fact, a very eminent linguist from the UK, from Edinburgh, actually described the book as Towards Analysis of Discourse as not linguistics. And actually, I remember the first job, I've forgotten this actually, it's terrible, things that come back to you. I failed to get a job in about 10 years later. And the reason that was given to me was because when I talked about discourse, it was not considered to be linguistics, but it was considered to be social psychology. But John Sinclair wrote with Malcolm Coulthard towards an analysis of discourse, and he went on to become really probably the leading figure in corpus linguistics. I mean, that's my judgment about that, not that I know the field very well, because actually I didn't agree with the direction he was going in, but that's another matter. He was hugely influential, became hugely influential. And when I went to his retirement talk, he confessed that when he did start publishing, none of his journal articles had been peer-reviewed except for one. And that one was rejected. So I don't know what you make of that, but I mean, if you were to look at citations of his work now, it's just astronomical, I think. Okay. And the final person I want to mention from that department, and again, he was in his 30s around this time, is this person here. This is Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall basically was, around about that time, had joined a figure called Richard Hoggart to set up a Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. So the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham was only set up in the late 60s. And by the middle of my degree, he had become the acting director and then the director of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. But during the time I was doing my first degree, cultural studies was being defined as an academic subject area, and defined by this person more than anybody else. So there were these three guys, one literature, one language or linguistics, and one cultural studies. And if we were to go back to my shaky circle diagram, around language in the middle is culture and society, and the other stuff, media and literature. And I think probably I have to confess that my work must have been deeply influenced by these three guys. But now I'm going to mention how did I find my way? Because it wasn't as if I sat there thinking, oh, this guy's got all the answers, I must do cultural studies or I must do linguistics or whatever. I kind of found my way in the direction that I'd ended up through encounters with certain books. And this was one book that had a deep influence on me, called Language, Thought and Reality, by an American. I nearly said it by an American linguist, but actually Benjamin Lee Whorf, in his real life, in his job, in his main job, was actually a fire safety engineer, a fire safety inspector, working for an insurance company. And he was much liked actually by the clients. He brought new clients, he brought extra clients to the insurance company by his astute observation of fire dangers in the places that he examined on their behalf. And one of the examples that he uses to illustrate the relationship between language and habitual thought and behavior was an anecdote from his time as a fire inspector, insurance, whatever, was an incident that he observed in one factory that he visited around the storage of gasoline drums. They were stored in two separate rooms, depending upon whether they were full or empty. Now, gasoline drums look the same from the outside, whether they're full or empty. They put the full ones in one room and the empty ones in another room, and they put a label on the door saying full gasoline drums and another label on the other room saying empty gasoline drums. And the guys behaved very differently, the workers behaved very differently around the empty gasoline drums. They treated them as if they were not dangerous at all, so they would smoke beside the empty gasoline drums. But of course, we know that an empty gasoline drum is full of inflammable gas. So they were highly dangerous. They were possibly more dangerous than the full gasoline drums. So the difference between describing something as full and describing something as empty had massive consequences. And he used this as a way, used this example just to illustrate the significance that language has in organizing the world for us. Of course, he became famous as a linguist and worked with another very eminent linguist, American, called Edward Sapir, and together they formulated what came to be known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which basically says that there is like a principle of linguistic relativity, a bit like the principle of relativity in physics. And in this principle of linguistic relativity, the language that we habitually use helps to shape the world of our experience for us, so that we see the world in different ways depending upon our habitual language. So he said Hopi, for instance, which is an American Indian language, is very different from European languages, especially English. In fact, so much so that you could call, he compared actually English with Hopi. It was a bit like the difference between a bludgeon and a rapier. That actually Hopi made some really interesting distinctions in their grammar, which he believed were actually more in line with physics of Einstein, the relativity of Einstein's theory, which confirmed his notion of kind of linguistic relativity. Okay, so I read this book with, well, it was like a kind of penny dropped, or my eyes opened, and I began to think, wow, there is a great deal to this linguistics that I need to find out more about. Okay. I'm going to try and keep this to 5 books. In fact, I might drop one. How am I doing? Okay. So if you want to go back to basics then, okay, so Whorf tells us something about the significance of language in our everyday lives. Let's see if we can find out more about language. So off I went and I put my head into this book, which is Course in General Linguistics, which you would think is a kind of basic primer, tells you what you need to know about linguistics. But actually this book was an extraordinarily revolutionary book. Although it was written in 1916, it wasn't written by Saussure himself. It was put together by 2 or 3 or 4 of his students who had attended his course of lectures over a 3 or 4 year period from about 1911 to 1914, or something like that. Yes. And in it, he basically repositioned linguistics. He basically changed the agenda completely. That in the 19th century, linguistics had been very historically oriented. It had really basically kind of looked backwards and traced changes in form over time from within one language or from one language to another, and it would actually reconstruct ancient languages from the evidence that you could pick up from looking at documents. So it was very historically oriented. And what Saussure basically did was to say, yes, that's important, but you cannot really methodologically do that unless you can actually describe the system at a particular moment in time. So he said, actually, your historical linguistics depends upon something that he called synchronic linguistics, the language now in all of its interrelationships. And in order to elaborate on the task, he then began to describe the basic components of languages, really fundamentally oriented around the sign and the sign's relationship with other signs. And for him, actually, perhaps the most radical step was to say that the value or the meaning of any one sign was basically a question of its relationship with every other sign in the system. Then another thing that he did was actually to say, this is how language works, but actually language is only one of many sign systems, and that it can provide us a model for looking at the behavior of sign systems in society. Sign systems as diverse as the kinship system, who marries whom, in what society, what kinds of relationships they enter into. Myth as a sign system, and so on. So the interesting thing, really interesting thing about this is that, okay, he gave his lectures. He never wrote the book. The students wrote from his lecture notes the book. The book comes out. I think it had its own influence on the shape of linguistics, and in fact is treated as the basis for structural linguistics. But in early 1970s, it's translated or becomes widely available in the English-speaking world as the course in general linguistics. And it sweeps across humanities departments and begins to define really a thing that became to be known as structuralism. That basically so much of human meaningful behavior takes place within systems, and it's structured, and you can actually use the techniques of linguistics to define what those are. Of course, that led to a backlash, but I won't go into that. So we're actually still back with me. Probably I've maybe finished my first degree by now and have discovered one or two other books, and this was one of the ones that I read. Okay. This is a book which was by Saussure was Swiss. This book and the first the course in general linguistics was first published in 1916, I think it was. A reply comes from Russia the Soviet Union in those days in 1929, 1930, from a circle of scholars in St. Petersburg who gathered around a figure that my literary colleagues will know well as Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin. Voloshinov was one of that same circle and shared many of the outlooks of Mikhail Bakhtin. And the book actually is a critique of Saussure. It takes issue with some of the basic founding principles that Saussure enunciated. But of course, in 1929 in Russia, it didn't really make very many waves because quite a lot of the intellectuals were kind of disappearing. I don't think we quite know what happened to Voloshinov, but what he did was, and I'm only really just taking a kind of tiny snapshot of part of each of these books, basically. But for this particular book, he took issue with Saussure and Saussure's notion of the sign. For Saussure, the signs just existed in kind of tension with each other, in an abstract system. Voloshinov said, no. He said that the sign actually doesn't only exist in the abstract world of the sign system, it exists in everyday life, in the process of interaction between one individual consciousness and another. so that dialogue and interaction was central to his way of thinking about how language operates. And so much so that he would also argue that consciousness only becomes consciousness in the process of social interaction between people. So if we go back to Wolf, and if we go back to Saussure, both of them were actually thinking about a language or a science system sort of as a kind of self-enclosed entity. What Voloshinov does is he tries to put the science system back into social life. And being a Marxist, he had a strong commitment to the class struggle. And one of the things that he said about signs was that they changed their meaning in the course of the struggle between social forces. And basically, people struggle over the meaning of signs. Okay. Next, so I'm kind of, I was reading other books. But these books kind of, when I tried to think about how to talk today, I just thought I have a way of pinning it together, and I just thought, restrict yourself to 5 books, no more, no less. I nearly put a 6th in, and I'm actually going to drop one of the books because we probably won't have time, but anyway. This was another book. Now the first 3 books all come out of linguistics in one way or another. And I forgot to kind of emphasize this point. Like Saussure, the book that Saussure wrote had a delayed life, if you like. It had a double life. It came out in 1916 or so. It had its own reactions amongst the scholarly community. And then it's almost as if it went into abeyance, and then was rediscovered in the 70s. It's similar with Voloshinov. Voloshinov's book came out published in St. Petersburg, or Leningrad as it was then, and was kind of forgotten. Then was rediscovered in the 70s and translated into English, and then had a big impact. So these books have a kind of delayed reaction. This one, there's no delayed reaction. It came out in 1961, a few years before I began my undergraduate degree. And it's called The Long Revolution by a cultural critic called Raymond Williams. And to speed things up, I'm just going to mention 2 ideas that came out of The Long Revolution, which I've always kind of liked. One of them being that culture is ordinary. It's not necessarily special, it's not necessarily the greatest books, it's not necessarily Shakespeare, it's not necessarily Verdi's operas. Culture actually may well be those things, but it's also the everyday, meaningful behavior that people engage in all the time. So, in a way, culture is as much to do with chopsticks as it is with opera. How we conduct ourselves, how we make meanings around the small events and activities of everyday life was what he was getting at. And I have to say, probably, it's an unacknowledged kind of premise in much of what I've done, is that it's the ordinary things as well as the extraordinary things that we have to recognize, notice, and see what happens in significances we can find in them. And one of the other concepts from his book is the notion of a structure of feeling. And it's actually very difficult. But the reason why I think it's such an interesting idea, the notion of a structure of feeling, is that basically we live now in an age of cognitive inquiry, you know. Everything is to do with cognition, and cognitive structures, and the patterns that the brain manages to produce. And these are often kind of thought of in terms of propositional content. They're often thought of in terms of ideas rather than anything else. What Williams captures in the concept of a structure of feeling is the notion of that somehow, in particular ages, our feelings are not just individual, they are also kind of patterned in a way which is shared amongst many members of the community without us really knowing. But I think recent events in Europe and the United States would suggest that there is some usefulness in this idea of a structure of feeling, because one of the reasons why many people voted for Trump, one of the reasons why many people voted for Brexit, could be to do with a structure of feeling. But basically they felt anxious, resentful, angry. They have no time for, they feel left behind, ignored. And that seems to be a common kind of perception amongst many people in the United States and in Europe. So that kind of constellation of feelings, I think, we could see as a structure of feeling, and it's been very interestingly blah blah. Okay. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. No? Okay. Oh, that's so nice. Okay. Goffman. Goffman is this is the most recent of the books that I mentioned. The books kind of go back most of last century. This one is from the latter end of last century, and it's 1981. It's a late work by Goffman. Goffman has an extraordinary range of scholarship, but all of Goffman's scholarship is actually about everyday life in one way or another. It's about how people conduct themselves in institutions. It's about how people have a kind of front for public occasions, and they behave very differently in private and in public. They have a front stage, if you like, and a backstage. You've got my front stage behaviour now. I won't say anything about my backstage behaviour. He had many, he has a wonderful way of unpacking the small details of social behaviour. And one of his most influential publications was a book called Interaction and Ritual, and the first essay in that book is an essay called On Face Work. And he couldn't have written that very important chapter, which then became the basis for a theory of politeness in Western pragmatic linguistic philosophy. He couldn't have written that very interesting chapter without knowledge of China. On face work, it's about face. It's about maintaining face in an interaction. It's deeply rooted in the concept of face from China. But, and I read that with great interest before it had become co-opted by Brown and Levinson for their theory of politeness. But this book, just very briefly, one of the things that he defines in this book is the notion of a participation framework. If you go back to Saussure and if you go back to Voloshinov, their model of communication is actually a speaker and a hearer, two people engaged in interaction, if you like. What Goffman pointed out is that actually, because we have all different kinds of ways of mediating talk, we have different relationships to language depending upon the situation that we're in. We're not always a speaker and a hearer. Okay, so I'm a speaker now and you're a hearer, but you're not just a hearer, one person, you're an audience. And as an audience, you actually behave in a way different than a simple hearer. So sometimes you smile together or laugh together. There's actually a kind of collective presence in the audience. And that goes beyond the notion of a speaker and hearer. And once you get into things like broadcasting and print and other forms of mediation, we have all kinds of different relationships to the linguistic communication that's taking place. And I'd already begun work on media discourse long before I got into forms of talk, but it actually helped me clarify what I was doing. And without his notion of the participation framework, it would have been quite difficult for me to do some of the work that I did. Like, for instance, this was 1981. Probably my first journal article, or second journal article, was an article called DJ Talk, which was about radio disc jockeys talking between records and the peculiar relationships that get set up between the speaker and the audience. How some parts of the audience are mentioned by name and some are not. And really, without Goffman and without Raymond Williams and without the other guys, I probably wouldn't have written that paper, because it's about very ordinary kind of linguistic behavior. Okay. Right. So out of all of those, that was 5 books, I would just want to kind of emphasize that for me, language is a system, but it's actually, by that I mean more than the signs interlock with each other, but that we can study it in systematic ways. We can find patterns and regularities by regarding its form, and that language is grounded in interaction, and that it shapes, guides, and influences our way of seeing the world, and also, especially now, but more than we realized, it's mediated, and always has been. Okay. Now, I pinned this on books, and I just want to finish by really reflecting slightly on the role of the book. There's a wonderful book by Elizabeth Eisenstein, the title of which is something like Printing and Social Change. I don't know whether anybody else can remember the title properly, but basically it says, without the book you wouldn't have had science that we know, of the kind that we know now. We wouldn't have had the rise of secularism, we wouldn't have had the Protestant Reformation and so on. We had the rise of the printing press, I should say, rather than the book. The rise of the printing press was crucial in social terms. I just want to kind of go back to the notion of 4 or 5 books and the way they carried ideas for me. All of these, most of these books had unusual histories. They had a life, and then a half-life, and then another life. And they moved from one society and one language to another. Sometimes they were almost published by accident. You know, they existed as manuscript notes from students at lectures and so on. But their influence, I think, on other people as well as me, has been enormous. And what I do wonder now, and I apologize actually for going back so far, so last century, if I was to try and do that over the last 10 years or 15 years, would I be able to find 5 books? And I'm not sure that I could. Something has happened in intellectual culture, and something has happened in publishing, and something has happened in research that's changed the way that books fit in to the creation of knowledge. Whether it's a loss or not, I think we have to leave it to posterity to decide. But I think it would be a shame if we gave up reading books. And the university is the place where books can and should be read. This is, I think part of the problem is everything is speeded up so much. We don't have time to read books. That's it. I mean, I would have loved to have gone back and read these 5 books before doing this talk. And then I might have been a bit more accurate, but has it become harder to read the key book? Has it become harder to write the key book? I was at a conference a couple of years back where one of the speakers, with the same name as myself, Lucy Montgomery, she said something like, publishers are not really interested in publishing monographs. In fact, actually, she says academics are not interested in reading them either. What we do is we read the journal article, or we produce journal articles, but sometimes the most valuable ideas are there in the book. And I think somehow or other, it's only in a book sometimes that you can take time enough to develop an idea. Strangely enough, when you go back and read a book, or try and remember a book, it's only a few key ideas. It's almost as if basically 2/3 of the book you didn't need. I think Samuel Goldwyn Mayer said something like, what was it? I can't remember. But it's like, you know, I've just basically lifted a few ideas out of 5 books. But I just don't, I think, do you need the whole book for those ideas? I think you probably do. I think you needed the book in order to be able to get that idea out and write. Even though if you go back and try and remember the whole book, you can't remember the whole book. You only remember the idea. Anyway, okay. Okay. So, from me on my bike in the past, so last century, to the future. So this is where I'm going in 3 weeks' time. Here are the 3 grandchildren. Tesla, Lawrence and Matilda, ready for bed. I'm waiting for somebody to read their bedtime story from a book. Thank you. I haven't talked about 7 years in Macau. The reason is it's actually too difficult for me to do. It's too close to me and I cannot really, it hasn't got a shape. I can remember 1968, I can remember 2016, but the thing about remembering is that it gets easier to remember the long past than the immediately past because it's got a shape, it's already got a contour, and I haven't got a contour for the last few years, for my 7 years in Macau. What I have got though is this overwhelming feeling of this was the most interesting, the most colourful, the most enjoyable, the most delightful part of my academic life. Maybe it's been 50 years, but this has been tremendously exciting and I really would like to thank all of you. But I would also, most particularly, I'd like to thank the members of the appointing panel. Number 1, Professor Martins.